Climate change is no longer a distant threat. It's a present reality reshaping our world. One of its most dramatic consequences is sea level rise, driven by melting ice caps, expanding ocean water as it warms, and the collapse of glaciers. Scientists predict that by the year 2100, sea levels could rise anywhere from 3 to 7 feet, with some worst-case scenarios suggesting even more. This may not sound catastrophic until you realize that billions of people live in coastal cities built at or near current sea levels. Major population centers, economic hubs, and historic cities that have stood for centuries or millennia face existential threats from rising waters. Some cities are already experiencing regular flooding that was once considered rare. Others are implementing desperate measures, seawalls, pumps, and elevation projects that may only delay the inevitable. This is 31 cities that will be underwater by 2100 based on current scientific projections, assuming we don't drastically reduce emissions or implement massive engineering interventions. Some may survive through extraordinary effort and expense. Others will almost certainly be abandoned or fundamentally transformed. These aren't distant possibilities. Children born today will witness these changes in their lifetimes. Let's explore which cities face the greatest threats from the rising seas. Number 1. Venice, Italy. Venice has been slowly sinking and flooding for centuries, but climate change is accelerating the crisis. Built on wooden pilings driven into marshland, Venice sits barely above sea level. The city experiences acqua alta, high water flooding with increasing frequency and severity. What was once a rare phenomenon now occurs regularly, sometimes flooding the famous St. Mark's Square multiple times per week. Italy has constructed the MOSE flood barrier system, essentially giant gates that can be raised to block storm surges, but this is a temporary solution. As sea levels continue rising and the city continues slowly sinking due to groundwater extraction and sediment compression, Venice faces an uncertain future. By 2100, even optimistic scenarios show significant portions of Venice permanently underwater. Without dramatic intervention, one of the world's most beautiful and historic cities may become uninhabitable, preserved only as a tourist attraction accessible by boat during low tides. Number 2. Miami, Florida. Miami is particularly vulnerable to sea level rise because it sits on porous limestone bedrock that allows seawater to infiltrate from below. Traditional seawalls won't work because water simply comes up through the ground. The city already experiences sunny day flooding during high tides even when there's no storm, with seawater bubbling up through storm drains. Miami Beach has spent hundreds of millions raising streets, installing pumps, and implementing temporary fixes, but these measures are already proving insufficient. By mid-century, parts of Miami will flood regularly, and by 2100, much of the metropolitan area, home to over 6 million people, will be underwater. Real estate values in vulnerable areas are already declining as the threat becomes undeniable. Miami represents the perfect storm of sea level rise vulnerability. Valuable real estate, large population, geographic limitations, and geology that makes traditional defenses impossible. Number 3. New Orleans, Louisiana. New Orleans already sits largely below sea level, protected by an extensive levee system. The city is sinking due to sediment compaction and subsidence, while sea levels rise and the Mississippi River Delta erodes. Hurricane Katrina in 2005 demonstrated the city's vulnerability when levees failed catastrophically, flooding most of the city and killing over 1,800 people. Since Katrina, New Orleans has rebuilt and improved its flood defenses, but the long-term prognosis is grim. The city is losing an acre of coastal wetlands every hour to erosion and subsidence, removing natural storm buffers. By 2100, even with extensive engineering, large portions of New Orleans will be underwater or require constant pumping to remain habitable. The city faces an existential choice: invest tens of billions in increasingly desperate flood defenses or begin managed retreat. For a city with such deep cultural heritage, both options are tragic. Number 4. Amsterdam, Netherlands. The Netherlands has fought the sea for centuries, with much of the country already below sea level. Amsterdam, built on reclaimed land and protected by dikes, pumps, and water management systems, represents humanity's most sophisticated battle against the ocean. Dutch water engineering is world-renowned, and the country has successfully protected itself for generations. However, rising sea levels present challenges that may exceed even Dutch capabilities. The Netherlands is implementing the Room for the River program, giving water more space rather than just blocking it and constructing floating neighborhoods. But by 2100, protecting Amsterdam and other Dutch cities will require increasingly extreme and expensive measures. The country may survive through engineering genius and national commitment, but the effort will be enormous and constant. Amsterdam faces not immediate catastrophe, but rather a future of endless expensive adaptation. Number 5. Bangkok, Thailand. Bangkok is sinking faster than almost any major city, up to 2 inches per year in some areas, due to groundwater extraction for the growing population and heavy buildings compressing soft soil. Combined with rising seas and frequent flooding from monsoons, Bangkok faces a compound crisis. Parts of the city already flood regularly during rainy season, disrupting millions of lives. The city is built on clay soil with poor drainage, making it naturally prone to flooding. By 2030, significant portions of Bangkok will experience regular flooding, and by 2100, much of the city will be underwater or uninhabitable without massive intervention. Thailand is attempting to slow groundwater extraction and improve drainage, but these measures cannot reverse subsidence that's already occurred. With over 10 million people in the metropolitan area, the potential human displacement is staggering. Bangkok shows how human activities like groundwater pumping can make sea level rise even worse. Number 6. Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. Vietnam's largest city, with over 9 million people, sits on the Saigon River Delta barely above sea level. The Mekong Delta region is already experiencing severe erosion, saltwater intrusion into freshwater supplies, and land subsidence. Ho Chi Minh City floods during monsoon season even now, and these floods are worsening. Like Bangkok, Ho Chi Minh City is sinking due to groundwater extraction and sediment compaction. By mid-century, parts of the city will flood regularly, and by 2100, large areas will be permanently underwater. Vietnam lacks the resources of wealthier nations to implement extensive defenses. The city faces difficult choices about managed retreat, adaptation, and protecting critical infrastructure. Ho Chi Minh City's vulnerability represents the broader threat to Southeast Asian delta cities, housing hundreds of millions of people. Number 7. Shanghai, China. Shanghai, China's largest city with over 24 million people, is built on river sediment that's compacting, causing the city to sink even as seas rise. The city already uses extensive pumping systems to manage water, but future demands may exceed capacity. Shanghai is critical to the Chinese economy, making its vulnerability a national security issue. China has resources to defend Shanghai through massive engineering projects, and the government has announced plans for extensive seawalls and other defenses. However, by 2100, even optimistic scenarios show significant portions of Shanghai underwater or requiring constant active protection. The city may survive through unprecedented engineering, but the cost will be enormous. Shanghai demonstrates that even authoritarian governments with vast resources face limits when fighting rising seas. Number 8. Alexandria, Egypt. Alexandria, founded by Alexander the Great over 2,300 years ago, sits on Egypt's Mediterranean coast at minimal elevation. The ancient city holds extraordinary historical significance and currently houses over 5 million people. Much of the Nile Delta, where Alexandria sits, is subsiding due to reduced sediment from the Aswan Dam upstream. By 2100, large portions of Alexandria will be underwater, threatening ancient sites and displacing millions. Egypt lacks resources for extensive defenses, and the Nile Delta's broader subsidence makes the problem regional, not just local to Alexandria. The city faces losing not just buildings but also irreplaceable archaeological sites from Greco-Roman civilization. Alexandria's flooding would represent both humanitarian crisis and cultural catastrophe, erasing history beneath the waves. Number 9. Jakarta, Indonesia. Jakarta is sinking faster than any other major city, in some areas up to 10 inches per year, making it possibly the most vulnerable megacity to flooding. Built on swampy ground with poor drainage, Jakarta suffers from excessive groundwater extraction as millions pump water from aquifers, causing land to compact and sink. Parts of North Jakarta have already sunk over 8 feet. The situation is so dire that Indonesia is building an entirely new capital city on the island of Borneo, planning to relocate government functions away from sinking Jakarta. By 2050, parts of Jakarta will be permanently underwater, and by 2100, much of the city of over 10 million people will be uninhabitable. Indonesia is attempting to construct a massive seawall around Jakarta Bay, but critics doubt it can work given the scale of subsidence. Jakarta represents worst-case scenarios: rapid sinking, rising seas, poor planning, limited resources, and massive population. Number 10. London, England. London sits on the Thames River estuary, protected from storm surges by the Thames Barrier, a series of massive gates that can be raised to block high tides. Built in 1982 and designed to last until 2070, the barrier is already being used much more frequently than planned, suggesting it may become inadequate sooner than expected. By 2100, London will require upgraded flood defenses or face regular flooding. The Thames Barrier's replacement or enhancement will cost billions and require decades of construction. While London will likely survive through engineering and investment, the effort required will be substantial. Large areas of East London sit on floodplains and are particularly vulnerable. London shows that even wealthy nations with existing infrastructure must constantly adapt and upgrade defenses as seas rise beyond original planning assumptions. Number 11. New York City, New York. New York City experienced Hurricane Sandy in 2012, which flooded subways, tunnels, and entire neighborhoods, causing billions in damage and revealing the city's vulnerability. Built on islands and peninsulas, much of New York sits close to sea level, including JFK Airport, parts of Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens, and extensive waterfront development. The city is implementing various adaptation measures, including seawalls, elevated buildings, and redesigned waterfront areas, but these efforts are piecemeal and may prove insufficient. By 2100, regular flooding will threaten critical infrastructure including subway systems, tunnels, and power plants. Lower Manhattan and areas of Brooklyn and Queens will face persistent flooding during storms and eventually at high tides. New York will likely survive through massive investment in defenses, but the city will transform dramatically, abandoning some areas while heavily fortifying others. Number 12. Lagos, Nigeria. Lagos, Africa's largest city with over 20 million people, sits on coastal lowlands and lagoons barely above sea level. The city is growing rapidly with extensive informal settlements built in flood-prone areas. Lagos already experiences severe flooding during rainy seasons, and climate change is making these floods worse. Nigeria lacks resources for extensive flood defenses, and the city's rapid, often unplanned growth makes organized response difficult. By mid-century, flooding will worsen significantly, and by 2100, large portions of Lagos will be underwater or uninhabitable. The potential displacement of millions creates humanitarian crisis scenarios. Lagos represents challenges facing African coastal cities: rapid population growth, limited resources, informal development, and increasing climate threats. The city's future may involve massive population displacement with few good options for resettlement. Number 13. Osaka, Japan. Osaka sits on a river delta in Osaka Bay, with much of the city below sea level, protected by extensive levee systems and pumps. Japan has sophisticated engineering and resources to defend against flooding, and Osaka has extensive infrastructure for water management. However, rising seas and more intense storms challenge even Japanese capabilities. By 2100, Osaka will require upgraded and expanded defenses to prevent regular flooding. The city may survive through technology and investment, but the effort will be substantial and ongoing. Japan is implementing various adaptation strategies, but the long-term sustainability of protecting below-sea-level cities becomes questionable as oceans continue rising. Osaka shows that engineering can delay but not permanently solve the problem of defending low-lying coastal cities. Number 14. Mumbai, India. Mumbai, India's financial capital with over 20 million people, sits on a peninsula barely above sea level. The city already floods during monsoon season, and these floods are worsening. Much of Mumbai is built on reclaimed land that's poorly drained. Slums housing millions are in the most vulnerable low-lying areas. India has resources to protect Mumbai's most critical areas, but faces difficult choices about which parts of the city to defend and which to abandon. By mid-century, flooding will worsen dramatically, and by 2100, large portions of Mumbai will be underwater or uninhabitable. The city's importance to India's economy means abandonment isn't realistic, but defending it will require unprecedented investment. Mumbai represents the vulnerability of developing world megacities with huge populations and economic importance, but limited resources for comprehensive defenses. Number 15. Dhaka, Bangladesh. Bangladesh is among the world's most vulnerable nations to sea level rise and extreme weather. Dhaka, the capital with over 21 million people, sits on a river delta barely above sea level in a country where much of the population lives on vulnerable coastal areas and river deltas. The city floods regularly during monsoons, and cyclones cause devastating storm surges. By mid-century, flooding in Dhaka will intensify dramatically, and by 2100, much of the city and surrounding areas will be underwater or uninhabitable. Bangladesh has minimal resources for extensive defenses and faces potential displacement of tens of millions of people from coastal areas. Dhaka's crisis is part of a broader national catastrophe. Bangladesh may lose significant portions of its territory to the sea, creating one of history's largest refugee crises. The city shows how sea level rise affects not just individual cities, but entire nations. Number 16. Hamburg, Germany. Hamburg sits on the Elbe River estuary, and parts of the city are below sea level, protected by dikes and flood barriers. The city has centuries of experience managing floods and has sophisticated water management systems. However, rising seas and increased storm intensity from climate change present new challenges. Germany has resources to defend Hamburg through upgraded infrastructure, and the city is implementing adaptation plans. By 2100, Hamburg will require enhanced defenses but will likely survive through engineering and investment. The city's experience shows that wealthy Northern European nations can probably protect major cities, but the cost will be substantial and continuous. Hamburg's future involves constant vigilance and adaptation rather than catastrophic loss. Number 17. Kolkata, India. Kolkata, formerly Calcutta, sits on the Ganges Delta in eastern India with over 14 million people in the metropolitan area. The city is low-lying and already experiences regular flooding during monsoons. The Ganges Delta is sinking due to sediment compaction and reduced sediment flow from upstream dams while seas rise. By mid-century, flooding will worsen significantly, and by 2100, large portions of Kolkata will be underwater or uninhabitable. India faces difficult choices about which cities to defend given limited resources. Kolkata's cultural and historical importance may justify investment, but defending the city will be extremely challenging given its geography. The city represents broader vulnerability of Indian Ocean coastal cities in developing nations. Number 18. Basra, Iraq. Basra, Iraq's second-largest city, sits at the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers near the Persian Gulf. The city is critical to Iraq's oil economy and has a population exceeding 2 million. Basra sits barely above sea level and is sinking due to subsidence from oil extraction and groundwater pumping. Rising seas combined with land subsidence create severe vulnerability. Iraq has limited resources and faces political instability that makes organized climate adaptation difficult. By mid-century, Basra will experience worsening floods, and by 2100, much of the city may be underwater. The loss of Basra would damage Iraq's economy and displace millions in a region already destabilized by conflict. The city shows how climate change intersects with political fragility to create compound crises. Number 19. Charleston, South Carolina. Charleston, one of America's oldest and most beautiful cities, sits on a peninsula barely above sea level. The city already experiences regular nuisance flooding during high tides, and these floods are becoming more frequent. Historic areas flood dozens of times per year during the highest tides. By mid-century, Charleston will flood regularly enough to disrupt daily life, and by 2100, significant portions will be permanently underwater without extensive defenses. The city is implementing various adaptation measures, but the long-term prognosis is challenging. Charleston's vulnerability threatens not just a modern city, but also irreplaceable colonial-era architecture and historic sites. The city must choose between massive investment in defenses or managed retreat from low-lying historic areas. Number 20. Guangzhou, China. Guangzhou, a major Chinese city of over 15 million people, sits on the Pearl River Delta barely above sea level. The city is critical to China's economy and is sinking due to groundwater extraction and sediment compaction. Like other Chinese coastal cities, Guangzhou already experiences flooding during typhoons and heavy rains. China will likely invest heavily in defending Guangzhou through seawalls and other infrastructure. But by 2100, even extensive engineering may prove insufficient for some areas. The Pearl River Delta as a whole, including Hong Kong, Shenzhen, and Macau, represents one of the world's most economically productive regions and also one of the most vulnerable to sea level rise. Guangzhou's future depends on China's willingness to invest enormous resources in protecting the region. Number 21. Recife, Brazil. Recife, on Brazil's northeast coast, has a population over 4 million and sits on coastal plains barely above sea level. The city already floods regularly, and climate change is making storms and floods more severe. Much of Recife's population lives in low-lying informal settlements particularly vulnerable to flooding. Brazil faces resource constraints that limit extensive defenses, and Recife's vulnerability is severe. By mid-century, flooding will intensify, and by 2100, large portions of the city will be underwater or uninhabitable. Recife represents challenges facing Latin American coastal cities: significant populations, limited resources, inequality that concentrates vulnerability in poor communities, and geography that makes defense difficult. Number 22. Georgetown, Guyana. Georgetown, capital of Guyana, sits on the Atlantic coast below sea level, protected by a seawall built during colonial times. The city houses over 200,000 people and is vital to the small nation's economy. The seawall is deteriorating and was never designed for current sea levels, let alone future rise. Guyana lacks resources for extensive upgrades to coastal defenses. By mid-century, flooding will worsen, and by 2100, Georgetown may be largely uninhabitable without massive international assistance for flood protection. For small nations like Guyana, sea level rise represents existential threats they cannot address alone. Georgetown shows how climate change disproportionately threatens small, poor nations that contributed minimally to causing the problem. Number 23, Savannah, Georgia. Savannah, another historic American coastal city, sits barely above sea level on the Savannah River estuary. Like Charleston, Savannah experiences increasing nuisance flooding and faces similar threats from sea level rise. The city's historic district with colonial-era architecture is particularly vulnerable. By 2100, significant portions of Savannah will flood regularly or be permanently underwater without extensive intervention. The United States has resources to defend important cities, but choices must be made about which cities receive major investment. Savannah's relatively small size compared to cities like New York may limit the resources devoted to its defense. The city faces a future of either expensive adaptation or gradual abandonment of vulnerable areas. Number 24, Manila, Philippines. Manila, capital of the Philippines with over 13 million people in the metro area, sits on Manila Bay barely above sea level. The city floods regularly during monsoons and typhoons, and climate change is making these events more severe. Parts of Manila are sinking due to groundwater extraction. The Philippines has limited resources for extensive defenses, and Manila's dense population and rapid growth make organized adaptation difficult. By mid-century, flooding will worsen significantly, and by 2100, large portions of Manila will be underwater or uninhabitable. The city represents vulnerability of Southeast Asian coastal megacities. Huge populations, limited resources, exposure to extreme weather, and land subsidence from groundwater use. Number 25, Karachi, Pakistan. Karachi, Pakistan's largest city with over 16 million people, sits on the Arabian Sea coast. The city already experiences flooding during monsoons, and its rapid, often informal growth has created extensive settlements in flood-prone areas. Pakistan's political instability and resource constraints limit organized climate adaptation. By mid-century, Karachi will experience worsening floods, and by 2100, significant portions will be underwater or uninhabitable. The potential displacement of millions creates humanitarian crisis scenarios in an already unstable region. Karachi shows how sea level rise intersects with existing challenges, poverty, rapid urbanization, weak governance, to create compound disasters. Number 26, Copenhagen, Denmark. Copenhagen sits on coastal lowlands, with much of the city barely above sea level. Denmark has resources and technical capability for extensive adaptation, and Copenhagen is implementing various climate resilience measures, including green infrastructure, updated drainage, and coastal defenses. By 2100, Copenhagen will require enhanced defenses, but will likely survive through engineering and planning. The city is transforming to work with water rather than just fighting it, creating parks that can flood during storms, redesigning streets to channel water, and integrating climate adaptation into urban planning. Copenhagen represents best-case scenarios where wealthy, well-governed cities implement comprehensive adaptation early enough to prevent catastrophe. Number 27, Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Rio de Janeiro sits on Brazil's Atlantic coast with iconic geography including mountains, beaches, and bays. While the city's hilly terrain means much of it sits above immediate flood risk, extensive low-lying coastal areas including beaches, favelas, and infrastructure are vulnerable. The city houses over 12 million people in the metro area. Brazil's resource constraints limit comprehensive defenses, and by 2100, Rio's coastal areas will experience regular flooding. The city's famous beaches may largely disappear. Favelas built on low-lying land face particular vulnerability. Rio shows that even cities with dramatic geography face significant threats in low-lying coastal zones. Number 28, Boston, Massachusetts. Boston sits on Massachusetts Bay with much of the city on fill land barely above sea level. The city already experiences flooding during storms, and sea level rise threatens critical infrastructure including tunnels, subways, and waterfront development. Boston is implementing various adaptation measures, but faces challenges protecting extensive vulnerable areas. By 2100, Boston will require significant enhanced defenses to prevent regular flooding. The United States has resources to protect major cities, and Boston's historical and economic importance justifies major investment. The city will likely survive through engineering, but will require ongoing expensive adaptation. Boston's future involves constant vigilance and adaptation rather than abandonment. Number 29, Maputo, Mozambique. Maputo, capital of Mozambique, sits on Maputo Bay barely above sea level. The city has over 1 million people and is Mozambique's economic center. The country is among the world's poorest and faces severe vulnerability to climate change including cyclones, flooding, and sea level rise. Mozambique lacks resources for extensive defenses, and by mid-century, Maputo will experience intensifying floods. By 2100, significant portions will be underwater or uninhabitable. Mozambique's vulnerability represents broader African coastal exposure, limited resources, rapid population growth, and climate impacts on nations that contributed minimally to emissions. Maputo may face abandonment or massive international assistance needs. Number 30, Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. Dar es Salaam, Tanzania's largest city with over 6 million people, sits on the Indian Ocean coast on low-lying land. The city is growing rapidly and faces increasing flood risks from sea level rise and intense storms. Much of the population lives in informal settlements in flood-prone areas. Tanzania has limited resources for comprehensive defenses, and the city's rapid, unplanned growth makes organized adaptation difficult. By mid-century, flooding will worsen significantly, and by 2100, large portions of Dar es Salaam will be underwater or uninhabitable. The city represents challenges facing rapidly growing African coastal cities, with large vulnerable populations and limited resources for adaptation. Number 31, Maldives. Male, capital of the Maldives, sits on an island barely 6 feet above sea level, making it perhaps the world's most vulnerable capital to sea level rise. The entire Maldives nation consists of low-lying islands that will largely disappear beneath rising seas this century. Male houses over 130,000 people packed onto a tiny island with nowhere to retreat. The Maldives is constructing an artificial island to relocate some population and implementing various defenses, but these are temporary measures. By mid-century, flooding will intensify dramatically, and by 2100, Male and most of the Maldives will be underwater. The nation faces potential total loss of territory, making it history's first country to disappear entirely due to climate change. Male represents the ultimate vulnerability, a nation with nowhere to go and no ability to defend against rising seas. The Maldives' fate is a warning of what unchecked climate change means for coastal regions worldwide. So there you have it, 31 cities that will be underwater by 2100 based on current scientific projections. These aren't distant possibilities or scare tactics. These are serious predictions based on observed sea level rise rates, ice melt measurements, and climate models. The cities on this list house hundreds of millions of people and represent trillions of dollars in infrastructure, real estate, and economic value. Some cities will survive through massive engineering projects, seawalls, elevated buildings, sophisticated water management. Others will implement managed retreat, abandoning vulnerable areas while protecting cores. Some may be largely abandoned as defense becomes impractical or too expensive. The differences in outcomes will largely depend on resources. Wealthy nations can defend major cities, while poor nations may lack options beyond retreat. These projections assume current trends continue without dramatic intervention. If humanity implements aggressive emissions reductions and removes carbon from the atmosphere, sea level rise could be limited, saving some cities. Conversely, if emissions continue unabated and feedback loops accelerate ice loss, the situation could be worse than current predictions. The year 2100 is a common projection endpoint, but sea level rise won't stop then. Oceans will continue rising for centuries. The human cost of these floods is staggering. Hundreds of millions may be displaced from coastal cities, creating refugee crises that dwarf anything in human history. Cultural heritage will be lost as historic cities drown. Economic disruption will be enormous as critical infrastructure floods. And this list only scratches the surface. Hundreds of smaller cities and towns worldwide face similar fates. These predictions should inspire action, not despair. Some cities can be saved through engineering and adaptation. Emissions reductions can limit how much seas rise. International cooperation can help vulnerable nations. But time is running out, and decisions made this decade will determine which cities survive and which drown. Which city on this list surprised you most? Do you live in or near a vulnerable coastal city? What do you think should be done to address this crisis? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this exploration of climate change impacts sobering and important, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more content about climate change, environmental issues, and how our world is changing. Thank you for watching, and remember, the future is not yet written. The cities that flood by 2100 depend on choices we make today.